I was playing black here against strong FIDE Master William Duckworth. This game, it gets really sharp and tactically interesting, so might take us a while to go through all the variations, but hopefully it'll be really cool and instructive, and everyone's tactical level will improve a bit. I played this last year in October in round robin tournament in Los Angeles. So my opponent played d4, I played d6, sort of tempting him to go into an e4 perk defense, and that's what he did. So knight f6, knight c3, c6. GM Akobian, who you guys probably know, he's given lectures here before. He showed me this system when I was his student, and he likes this line very well, and it's very interesting. It's basically a perk, but black plays this move c6 pretty early, and they don't always fianchetto their bishop on g7. So we'll eventually transpose into kind of like even a Philidor position after black plays e5. So it's an interesting line, especially when you want to kind of get a complicated game with black. So bishop e3, knight d7, queen d2, e5, knight e2. So my opponent is playing as if I was playing like the classical perk, like g6. So very popular line here is to play bishop e3, bishop g7, queen d2, and then play like f3 and h4, h5, bishop h6, and attack on the king side. So I'm guessing that was his idea against the system I chose. But it's not quite as effective here for white because I haven't played g6 and bishop g7, so there's no target yet on my king side for white to really attack. But he played knight e2. And his idea is to play knight g3 and maybe knight f5. And as we saw earlier, obviously this is a pretty dangerous plan sometimes, right? So bishop e7, f3, I castled, d5. So d5 is a very interesting move. Basically, white is trying to close the center so that he can attack on the king side. So I think a mistake here would be to play c5, because then there's no tension in the center, the position is closed, and white has pretty much free reign to attack on the king side. So they can play like g4 and knight g3, knight f5, and black doesn't have any counterplay yet. So white can proceed this way. So that's why I decided just to play knight b6, so that I'm always threatening to maybe take on d5 and try to open up the center. So it's not so, it's much riskier for white to start pushing their kingside pawns. So b3, I was threatening knight c4. And another move could have been knight g3 to protect the square with their bishop, but you know, white would love to put their knight on g3 after g2, g4. So this would be kind of awkward here, and the knight is blocking the g-pawn. So my opponent played b3, but this weakens the dark squares, especially the knight on c3 a little bit. But right now it's not so clear that black can really take advantage of this. So b3 is a very sensible move. Rook e8. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you ever consider exchanging the e-pawn, taking it with your c-pawn?
Yeah, I definitely thought about this move, and I did it a few moves later. But I guess I just wasn't sure if I wanted to do it just yet. I guess I thought I can always make this exchange, and I wanted to see how white develops their pieces first. Sometimes it's beneficial for black to just develop like bishop d7 and rook c8 and only then capture. And also I was thinking maybe he'll take on c6, which would be beneficial for me. So I figured rook e8 maybe just a flexible, useful move here. And actually, the point of this move is very interesting. I was thinking white might want to play a4 at some point to attack my knight on b6. And against this move, I was thinking about sacrificing a pawn with e4. So after white takes, knight g4, maybe bishop f4, and bishop f6. I thought black is getting good compensation here because I'm getting this e5 score for my knight, and the bishop is really strong on this diagonal. And I thought my rook is, of course, well placed on the e-file. So that was one idea behind rook e8, to potentially sacrifice this pawn. So I think for this reason, my opponent played h3, which is kind of impressive that he found my idea. And now, of course, he's controlling the g4 square. So here I eventually took on d5, and I played bishop f5. This is a really provocative move because, well, basically, what do you guys think white is going to do next after a move like bishop f5?
Well, he's not castled yet, g4.
Yeah, g4. I mean, this move is just asking white to play g4 because, you know, they wanted to play it already to attack on the king side, and here I'm letting him play g4 with a tempo. But I figured that, you know, my bishop would be really strong on g6 on this diagonal, and that there's not so much danger to my king yet because white doesn't really have a target so far. There's no pawn on g6 that white can attack with like h4, h5, open the h-file. So I figured, you know, I should be able to create counterplay in the center. So my opponent played h4. This is the definitely the most natural move, threatening h5. And here black has a few options here. So my first instinct was h5 myself, to try and lock up the king side. And if I takes, I can take with my knight, and h4 is hanging, and it seems like white's position is really weak. Pawn on h4 is weak, pawn on f3 is weak, and black's position looks really good. Like the pieces all have good squares and are playing. But I think I didn't like if white just plays g5. And I have to retreat my knight. If I play knight d7, maybe now a4 is annoying and a5 comes, and I don't know, I feel like black is getting a really passive position here. And white's going to castle queenside and play f4, and it looks like they're getting a pretty interesting attack here. But it might be okay for black. h6 was another option, but you know, g5 and takes, knight h7, and rook g1 just defending the pawn. And again, like my knight on h7 is out of the game, and next white's going to castle queenside and play f4 and try to attack. And I mean, these positions are very sharp, so that's definitely playable for black, but I was looking for a way to just try to get immediate counterplay so that maybe I could seize the initiative and try to win a very sharp game. So I came up with this move rook c8, which is kind of it's kind of a crazy idea. But after h5, what do you think black's next move is?
Knight takes d5.
That looks very interesting.
Bishop takes c7.
Bishop takes c2 is the idea. Yeah, let me quickly show you guys. So the point here is that if queen takes c2,
And then knight takes the pawn.
I take the central pawn. And black is getting a lot of play. We'll go back to this line. I want to look at knight takes d5 real quick because that's kind of interesting. So your idea is if knight takes d5, rook takes c2.
Exactly.
Right. Um,
Knight takes check, I guess.
yeah, it probably doesn't work out because white can take another piece with a check, and then maybe like queen d1, and the bishop's still trapped. So I don't think black really gets enough for the sacrifice material. But yeah, the point of rook c8 is to play bishop takes c2, luring the queen to c2, and then knight takes d5, with a lot of pressure on the c file. So I figure white will play bishop d2, defending the knight, getting the bishop out of the attack, and now like e4 is really strong. And this is an idea that's going to keep popping up in this game, is that once black plays e4, basically white's position starts falling apart. The point is, if white takes, I take with the knight. And bishop h4 check is a threat. I'm also threatening to take everything on c3. And white's king on e1 is, of course, very uncomfortable. And if, like f4, then black always has like e3 or knight takes g4. And then an important line is like if white castles queenside, knight b4, and knight d3 check, and knight d5. And basically white's king is in a mating net. Knight b4 is a threat, and white's in serious trouble, of course. So what's really funny about this position is that white doesn't have to take this bishop. Like, it's still trapped. So when I was calculating back here before rook c8, I saw these lines with queen takes e2 and knight takes d5. I got really excited. Then I saw rook c8, h5, bishop takes c2, rook c1, and I got really depressed. It looks like I'm just losing the piece anyways. And white's rook comes to c2, defends the knight on c3. I don't win the d5 pawn. It looks like I'm just losing a piece here. But then I started thinking further. I was in a really a fighting mood, so I wanted to try and make it work. And I came up with this idea to play e4. And after this move, white's in serious trouble because their king is stuck in the center, and a lot of their pieces are under fire here. So rook takes c2, I just take this pawn on f3. I'm threatening to win my piece back, and then g4 is also hanging. And then once the knight moves, knight takes g4, my rook on e8 is lined up against white's king, and this is really devastating. If the bishop moves anywhere, I'm going to have like a terrible discover check. And let's say king d1, I take on e3, bishop g5, and rook e3, for example, and I'm going to win the piece back on c3. And once black wins their piece back, they're going to be up a couple of pawns, and white's king is going to be really exposed. So, of course, that'll be winning for me. So once I saw this idea with e4, I realized that the sacrifice is probably going to work. Of course, it also comes with the idea to just play bishop d3 and save my piece. And white is basically just in dire straits here. Another possible move for white would have been g5, counterattacking the knight. And this is often the kind of move you might miss in your calculations because you generally only look for your own tactical resources and you don't look for ways for your opponent to counterattack. But of course you should, because sometimes your opponent might have some really strong tactical resource that you shouldn't miss. Here after g5, I think I can just take on f3, and white takes on f6, and then I just calmly recapture with the bishop. And the knight on e2 is hanging, and the knight on c3 is hanging. So white's knight can't move because the bishop takes c3. But you have to continue the line, because black is down a couple of pieces. Rook takes c2, takes, and here from far away I was able to see a nice tactic here. So maybe you guys can find it. The hint is that black's rooks are pretty perfectly placed, and it should be enough for a combination. So rook takes e3, cool. Queen takes e3. Yeah, that's probably good. Knight takes d5, and if knight takes, well, maybe this is risky, because they can take on f6. And if queen takes, they have queen e8 mate. And gf. Well, I have a lot of pawns for the piece, but now my king is open, so I don't know. This could be really unclear. Maybe white's even winning here. But I think you can just play. Can probably just play rook takes c3 and knight takes d5. And once I take on c3, I'm going to have a knight and 3 pawns for the rook, which is definitely enough material. And white's king, will be very weak and exposed. Black's king will be safe, and I'll have this really strong dark squared bishop. So this position is definitely winning for black. But other than rook takes c3 also, or rook takes c3, probably also works, but bishop takes c3 may be the simplest. And knight takes d5. And the queen moves, and black is just up 3 pawns. So yeah, I was really happy when I found this idea. Just bishop takes f6, and suddenly white can't, defend any of their pieces. So at this point, even though I obviously couldn't calculate everything out, because white does have some options on almost every move, intuitively I felt like black should have enough for their sacrifice, because there's all these tactics and tricks that are working out in my favor, and because white's bishop on e3 and their knight on c3, they end up hanging in so many lines that it's very likely that black should have enough play for the piece. So in the game, my opponent actually played g5 immediately, which I also considered. So I played, well, what did I play here? E4, yeah, exactly. This is just the key tactical idea, to open up the e-file and get my rook and bishop into play.
Is that something you started looking for when you saw the king wasn't castled? You just automatically say to yourself, I can open the center?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, what I was thinking here is that, white's king isn't yet castled, and their pieces are developed, but I felt like there was some kind of vulnerability to them. Also, after rook c8, I was thinking, if white doesn't play h5, well then this is a useful move, of course. So, if white doesn't play h5, then I don't see how they're going to make progress. And also the idea of putting the rook on c8 is that if white's knight ever goes to g3, I'm just going to sacrifice the exchange here and win the central pawn. And probably take the, dark squared bishop. In a position like this, I mean, there's some concrete lines here, of course, like the c2 pawn is hanging, and maybe I can play d5 and attack. But just to think about it, just think about the position. It's like black should always have enough compensation here, because the dark squared bishop is potentially very strong. White's king doesn't have a safe square, and for the exchange, I have 2 central pawns. So it's like intuitively, it seems like it should be a good sacrifice for black. So once I saw some of these lines, I figured that, as well as white's king being in the center, that there should be some kind of tactical potential here for me. So h5, bishop takes c2, g5, and e4. Now if my opponent takes on f6, I'm just going to recapture, and f takes e4. I have this nice move, bishop takes e4. And I'm threatening white's rook on g1, and if knight takes e4, I can think about taking the rook on a1, but I can also just take on e4. And let's say rook c1, trade rooks, and take this pawn. So basically, black has 2 pawns for the sacrificed piece, but white's king is going to be in the center for the rest of the game. My bishop on f6 is a very strong piece. My rooks are really active. And the most important thing here that really is going for black is that white just doesn't have any threats against my king. My king is perfectly safe. And psychologically, it's very hard to play a position without being able to create a threat. White just has to try and organize some kind of defense. And black's idea is to play like queen e7, put pieces on the e file, try to bother white's king. And any move here, I think the d5 pawn is also hanging concretely. And the worst thing that can happen here for black is white's able to consolidate and defend, and maybe even trade queens, if they're lucky. But I feel like even in the endgame, this wouldn't be so easy for white to win, because the pawn on d5 is probably weak and lost. The pawn on h5 is weak. So in the endgame, if I have 3 pawns for the piece, it's like black is hardly worse. So once I realized that at worst I'm like going to have 2 pawns for the piece, then definitely the sacrifice is worth it, because the first thing is that your opponent is probably not going to play the best defense, because it's very hard to find. And even if they do, you're not losing. So it's definitely a risk worth taking, I think. So any questions so far? I know it's a lot to cover after just like 14, 15 moves. OK, cool. So my opponent here played a really good defensive move. If you guys could find it, that would be great. But basically, he's trying to keep the position from blowing up, and he's trying to keep his king safe. Yeah, brilliant. f4. That's what he played. And it's a very good move because, well, strategically, because it keeps the e file closed. And for now, white's king is in the center, but at least the e file is not open, so it's somewhat safe. And also, white, is still attacking this bishop and is still attacking the knight. So I was, before I played rook c8, I did see this position, and I saw I would have knight g4. And this is pretty much where I stopped. I figured he can't take on c2 because I can take on e3. And my knight can retreat to safety to f5 if needed. And the other line I saw was that if bishop takes b6, very natural move, seeing as how both bishops were hanging, I would have queen takes b6, queen takes c2, queen f2 check. Now if king d1, I have knight e3 check. So king d2. And at the very least, I actually have a perpetual check here. Again, if king d1, knight f2 check wins the rook. So I saw that if my opponent plays all these moves, I can force a draw. And I figured this wasn't too bad because it requires my opponent to find a lot of good defensive moves. And then if we end up drawing anyways, well then, so be it. Like, I played a sacrifice that gave me tons of winning chances, tons of ways white could go wrong. And if their best is to force a draw, then that's totally fine. Like, because I have so many winning chances. And with black, it's perfectly acceptable. But then on his move, I was kind of thinking, looking for ways I could continue the game, because I'm down a piece, but white's king is obviously in a lot of trouble, and I found this move, bishop d8. I think right here, which is a really amazing move because the bishop is just coming to one of these diagonals, b6 or a5, and white's king is in huge trouble here. So something like rook h3, I was thinking to attack my queen. I give check, and e3 check. And the reason this works now is because white's rook left h1, so now the king can't go to c1 or d1 because the bishop on f1 is hanging. So earlier in this position here, if I tried that, white could just play king c1, and it looks like their king is escaping to safety. And black is down a piece. I mean, there's some compensation, but looks like white's king is getting pretty safe. But here I was thinking bishop d8, and I didn't find like a good move here for white because, both knights are pinned. The bishop doesn't have any moves, and the king can't castle. So I was thinking rook h3 is the most natural move to kick my queen. But now since the king has to come to d3, I figured black has some checkmates here. So I found knight e5 check. And after takes, queen f5 check, wins white's queen. Which is a really nice mate. Also, there's another mate here, if I can remember correctly. King e4. I think knight c4 check. And if the king keeps moving this way, rook e5 check. So pawn's pinned here, and then rook takes g5. I didn't see this during the game, but I found it afterwards. It was really beautiful. I assumed I would have mate during the game, so I didn't feel like looking any further.
Could the knight also swung to the king side instead of the queen side in that? When you started the whole thing?
Probably this is good enough. I can't imagine it's not. So yeah, just some cool lines I found. But I was really proud of finding this move bishop d8 because it's just crushing. Like the bishop just comes to a5 and there's too much pressure on white's position, and there's nothing they can really do to defend. So instead of taking on b6, my opponent played this move, bishop h3, which I actually missed this move originally when I played rook c8. Which, I mean, hopefully you can forgive me because, white's pawns are on g4 and f3, so it was like, it didn't cross my mind that, my knight is going to be on g4 and getting pinned on the light squares. But bishop h3 was played. And here, I guess I assumed that once I take on e3, I should have a really good attack here because I've gotten rid of white's dark-scored bishop. That's their best piece. And if I can trade it off for a knight, then my dark-scored bishop becomes much stronger, and I should be able to get a lot of counterplay. But here it's concrete. And I mean, I'm kind of fortunate that black has enough resources to keep the attack going. So if queen takes e3, my bishop on c2 is safe, and I can move my rook, maybe rook c5, and I think black's even up a pawn here, and the bishop is saved. through the d3 square. So that, of course, would be perfectly fine. So the critical continuation is to take on c8. So now I play knight g2 check. But even if I played, well, actually, knight g2 check is okay. King f1. If king f2, I have e3 check, winning the queen. So king f1. And queen takes c8 was my original thought. King takes g2, I give check. And rook c8, or bishop d3 is also okay. And basically, black is down in exchange here. But, white's king is kind of weak, and my bishop on d3 is a pretty good piece. Knight takes c4 is impossible because bishop takes e4, and then g3 knight is pinned. So I think black has really good compensation here for the exchange. Next, I can play like rook c8. And here I was thinking I can even play rook c8 immediately, with the idea that if white takes the bishop, I have this knight takes d5 again, and then I'm threatening the knight, which can't really be defended, and knight e3 check, knight takes f4 check, so this would have been good. But of course, white doesn't have to take the bishop here. So I think, again, black just has good compensation for the exchange because, white's king is in trouble, black's king is still really safe. But I was looking for more during the game because I was really, I calculated so much already. I was just trying to look for a way to completely destroy white's position here. So I found knight takes f4, which is a really cool sacrifice. I guess what was bothering me about this line is that, my bishop on e7 is kind of stuck because the pawn on d6, pawn on g5, and my rook on e8 is also stuck for the moment. So I thought if I play knight takes f4 with the idea bishop takes g5, I'm getting all my pieces out, and even though I'm sacrificing even more material, it's basically it's a very principled sacrifice because I'm getting all my pieces active and I'm breaking open white's king even further. So the main idea of this is that if like knight takes f4, bishop takes g5, and I have a lot of threats in this position. Right now I'm down a rook, but everything is hanging, so we can't stop our analysis here. Queen takes c2, queen takes c8. And so now this knight is hanging, and if the knight moves, I have knight takes d5. And this theme comes into play over and over, how the pin on the c-file allows me to take this d-pawn. And black's down a rook here, but they have a lot of threats, and those threats are really hard to meet. So knight e3 check is a threat, and bishop f6 is a threat, just winning a piece, because the knight can hardly be defended. And in this position, right now black is down a rook, but if I can win back a piece, I'll be down in exchange. But I have 4 pawns now. So a knight and 4 pawns against the rook is definitely winning, and that's pretty much what prompted me to go for the sacrifice. I figured I can at least win back a piece, probably on c3, in most of these lines. And if I get a position when I'm only down in exchange, but I have 4 pawns and white's king is so weak, then that should be a winning sacrifice. So after knight takes f4, there are other lines here, but my opponent played bishop g4, saving his light-scored bishop. I think it's a good decision because he wants to keep his light-scored bishop on the board, try to defend his king. I play bishop takes g5, queen takes c2. So again, black is down a rook, but I found this move, queen f6. And the main the main problem with white's position, of course, is their king is really exposed. And another small detail that's really important is that the rook on a1 is always hanging. And without this hanging rook, none of this would be possible because white would have stuff like knight takes e4. But here, of course, I just take the rook with check, and I win back my material, and white's king is still in huge danger. And this happens like this kind of thing just over and over again because the knight on c3 just can never contribute to the defense. And white is just in huge trouble here. So he played rook h2, trying to defend. King g1 was another option to get the king away from the queen. But knight takes a2 is a good move. And if queen takes e2, queen takes c3. If knight takes e2, I take the rook on a1. So bishop takes e2 is forced. And black just has a forced checkmate with the queen and bishop. Check. And queen g3. If knight takes e4, what move should we play? Yeah, just take it. And there's no back rank or anything. King g2, check, and here. I mean, with the king exposed like this, it's not hard to believe that black's queen and bishop can create some mating threats. Bishop g4 and check. And winning back the piece. I can probably take on g4 right away. Maybe this is even stronger. And white's king is just too weak. Maybe just want to find the most devastating victory here.
E3.
Maybe just e3, yeah. It's really bad for white. So I didn't see that all the way until checkmate, because there was a lot of moves, but back here, once I played knight takes f4, I pretty much saw that in all these lines, white's rook on a1 is hanging, so that prevents the c3 knight from ever contributing to the defense, and black's queen gets into the game very quickly, and basically white doesn't have enough defensive resources. So bishop g4, I took here, queen f6, rook h2. And I took this pawn finally. So if knight takes d5, queen takes a1 with check, and knight e3 check is a huge threat. So king g1. I think I took on e2. Yep. So I finally win back one piece, and the material count is a knight and 4 pawns for a rook. Of course, black is completely winning here. The pawns in the center are strong. Like, none of my pawns are weak. They're all very healthy. My king is perfectly safe. White's king is still weak, and black's even up in material. So rook f1, queen e5. As you can imagine, we were both in pretty serious time trouble here. So we didn't really play the most accurate moves. I don't think black has to take this bishop, but I think practically it's a really good decision just to simplify, because I'm up in material now. So I would love to just have an endgame, like bishop and 4 pawns against the rook, because that would be a very easy victory. But I just started pushing my central pawns. He played h6. I just took with the, actually I just played e3, threatening e2. Check. I just took with this pawn. Just to show my opponent, like, my bishop is super strong. And, you know, of course, white can resign here, but we were low on time, so we kept playing. Some moves, d4. Here, it's, I mean, I could have just played queen g4 check and, like, just gone for checkmate. Like, my king is, you know, clearly perfectly safe. White's queen on its own can't do anything. Just king g6, and there's no checks. And white's lost. Rook g2, take on d1. But, you know, I didn't even want to allow one check. Like, because you know, of course I knew the game was, like, really crazy and really cool so far. To spoil it, you know, by blundering something would have been, like, crushing. Like, my world would be destroyed. So I just wanted to, like, play the safest moves possible. Gave some checks to make it to the time control. And then finally I forced a queen trade just because I just want to play this endgame where I have no losing chances, you know, whatsoever. But it's a little embarrassing how long it took me to convert this, but we'll just look at the end of the game. Brought my king in. And then I brought my f-pawn, and my rook comes into h4 and h2. Basically, as long as I don't blunder my rook, I should win here. And all I need to do is bring my rook forward and f4. Now I'm threatening e2. So I could just play e2 immediately, but I figured f3 is even more crushing. And here, finally, my opponent resigned. So I hope that game was interesting to you guys.